Taya, does Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood exist? That was I had to wake the audience up, right?
I was actually at Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood last week. I was at a meeting at a station called WHYY, Philadelphia, which is where Mr. Rogers shot all of his shows. We were right in the same studio having a meeting. So I would say actually Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood does exist. Have any of you seen the movie about Mr. Rogers? You know, I highly recommend it because talk about passion. This man had a way of looking at the world and how we treat children that was so different. And as we matured into who he was, as he matured into who he was, he came up against a lot of criticism. So I highly recommend it because I don't think that Mr. Rogers lived in a fantasy world. I think Mr. Rogers actually lived in the world that we rarely acknowledge, which is children's world. And certainly at the time when Mr. Rogers was very popular, although he still is, he saw from a children's viewpoint, and we weren't very ready to see that. He made a lot of amazing moments. There was a period when Mr. Rogers was on the air, and there was a period when African Americans and whites were not allowed to swim in the same swimming pool. So what Mr. Rogers did is he created a character of the, I think it was a sheriff or the police. Was it the sheriff? Yeah. And he invited, the sheriff came on, and Mr. Rogers was soaking his feet in a little baby pool, and you know, it was very hot, and this is how he was cooling down, and the sheriff came on the set, and they had a little interaction, and Mr. Rogers asked him to share the pool and put his feet in the pool. And it was such a beautiful way to make such a powerful statement. And it was a way that a child, we could understand the double entendre of that, but it was also a way of a child, it's something so simple, just put your feet in the cold water with me, and a child could accept that.
Very nice. Very nice.
So, yeah. So
it was a warm-up question, but so here's here's the real question,
yes.
And if we can answer quickly, we can move
Okay.
to the next panelist. How do you does ethical consideration exist in a newsroom, and how do you vet through the reporting over the unbiases of a reporter? I know many times PBS or GPB does stories across the world. I've seen one on India, but they are covering mostly the minor, the someone who doesn't look like them. But how do you vet through the process that they're getting the information right? And how is it authentic?
I think if anyone says that journalists aren't biased, are not telling the truth. It is humanly impossible not to be biased because we each grow up with a set of values that are passed on to us from our parents. Now, we may not agree with those, and we may grow up thinking very differently, but we are biased. We are biased. It literally is impossible. So what you have to do is make sure that someone at least is reporting what they believe to be the truth. I will tell you there's nothing, the attack on journalistic entities right now is very painful for journalists. Let's be clear about this. These are people that work very, very hard, 85% of them. And I don't care whether you're, I just have to tell you that the Fox News Southeast Bureau is in my building. And I know most of those guys, and they're great guys. They are as hardworking as any other journalist. And I would say they were what we would call non-biased. So I think we have to be very careful in separating journalists out here as some very odd, strange, non-human. And they're not. They are trying so hard to tell you what they see. So it's not as hard as you think. I think the important thing are monitoring your sources, making sure that they have checked and double-checked, and they can still get it wrong. And they need to say when they get it wrong. But you have to believe that those that you believe in, and you choose who you believe in. Every day you pick up a newspaper and you choose who you believe in. Right after the election, I chose to take off all, out of my website, all the apps from every news television site, whether it was at Fox, MSNBC, whatever it was. Because I actually believed that the better journalism right now was being done by the newspapers. And I uploaded about 10 newspapers on my app. And I actually think 10 years ago, the better journalism was being done by those cable news networks, because they were taking us into places we had never been and showing us things we had never seen, and the newspapers were sort of dragging their feet. I think it's the opposite right now, and it doesn't mean that they are the people you agree or disagree with. That's just a given. But I do think that you have to look at how many sources, and I do not believe the New York Times is always right. I do not believe the Washington Post is always right. And I do not believe the Washington Times is always right. I think you have a responsibility that if you're in the business of consuming news and you're interested in it, you should look at several different sources. And in there, somewhere in there, you'll find your truth.
Definitely. Thank you. Well said, Taya. So before I ask the question for Frida, I would definitely like to acknowledge the Japanese Consulate General, Takashi. Thomas, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate